At the bend of Plum Creek stands a large flat-topped round rock resting on a pyramid-shaped base. It is an isolated part of the original rock formation, the softer part below being worn away. We find a crevice through which we climb to the top. Fire off our guns and christen the place Castle Rock, thinking we are the first to give it a name.
Back in 1858, several discoveries of gold along the Rockies Front Range brought fortune hunters west toward Pikes Peak. The first discovery was where the Santa Fe Trail met Russellville Gulch, later referred to by some as the birthplace of Colorado. The area was given the name of the great debater, Stephen Douglas, when Colorado became a territory in 1861. Pioneers began homesteading the region after President Lincoln signed an act in 1862, which offered 160 acres of land to anyone who filed a claim, paid a $10 fee, and would work the land for 5 years. The homesteaders' main activities were ranching and agriculture. No large quantities of gold were ever found around Russellville.
Mining for gold or silver was what brought me, as well as many others, who came to Colorado in those days. After 7 months in that mining camp, I was convinced that the goddess of fortune would not smile on me. So I decided to come down to the valley, take up a homestead, and build a home.
The new county of Douglas was one of 17 counties that made up the Colorado Territory. It stretched from the Platte River at the edge of the Rockies all the way east to the state of Kansas. The major trails were the Cherokee and Smoky Hill.
It was the 26th day of November, 1869, that I placed a homestead filing on the southwest quarter of Section 26, Township 8, Range 68. The settlers were few and far apart at that time. The roads were merely trails, no bridges over gulches or creeks, and we had mail service once a week.
Another homesteader named Jeremiah Gould also placed a filing. He bought an additional 40 acres and built a simple cabin on his 200-acre homestead. The claim was at the foot of the Castle Rock Formation.
Log houses were in vogue in those days, and any newcomer who was able to build a frame house was accused of putting on style.
From the county's formation in 1861, the seat of government was in Frankstown, on the major territorial trail between Denver and Santa Fe and just north of Russellville. But in 1874, two things happened. The county was reshaped into its present-day configuration, and a vote was held to move the county seat. On February 28, 1874, the Douglas County Commissioners voted to hold a special election to decide the location for the county seat of the new configuration. There were numerous places under consideration. A Rocky Mountain News article promoted Castle Rock.
If not one of the 7 wonders of Colorado, Castle Rock is yet a real wonder. It is a tremendous rock standing up in bold relief several hundred feet in height, rising up abruptly out of the plains, being visible from the cars of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Castle Rock is a point. It is somewhere.
The election was held on March 31st. There were 16 votes for Frankstown, 9 for Douglas, 30 for New Memphis, 63 for Glade, 164 for Sedalia, and 315 for Castle Rock. As a result of the election, the county seat of government was decided to be moved from Frankstown, where it had been since 1861, to Castle Rock. Until recently, the assumption was that the courthouse building was moved as well.
And when we would do city walking tours or any kind of tours explaining about the history of Douglas County, why the story had always went along with that, how this building was transported along over here to Castle Rock along with the government.
And the building that we know as the 1874 courthouse is 20 feet wide and 40 feet long and 2 stories tall. And it seems unlikely that a building of that size could be moved the distance from Franktown to Castle Rock, up Watson Hill, or even around to the north and up Crowfoot Valley Road. Kent Brandenberry came to do research in local history looking for some primary source material from the 1874 period. And we didn't have any. And as Kent and I looked through the materials that we had, it appeared that the real source of the information would be the clerk and recorder's office with the commissioner minutes and any other documents of the time.
Everybody had assumed that most of the records of Douglas County were lost.
The new Douglas County Courthouse stood proud on Courthouse Square until it was destroyed by an arsonist's fire in 1978. With that fire, the town's early records were thought to be lost until the 1990s, when curious citizens interested in the history of their surroundings were able to unravel historical facts which helped define the early history of the community.
I hope that either they still survived or that they had been saved. And sometime later, Kent came back with news that they were on microfilm and he needed me to come and look at them.
I'll never forget the day I found it. I let out a shout, I found it, and what I found was the contract that was let by the county commissioners for Douglas County's courthouse here in Castle Rock. And I called up Joanna at the library and I said, whatever you're doing, you better drop it and come down here. We found something.
We read the microfilm and copied it off. The copies weren't very clear, and we asked if the original ledger books existed. And they went into the vault and brought out the 1874 ledger books.
In fact, this vault was down in the basement of the old courthouse. After the fire and after all the smoke and heat settled down and they got into the ruins of the old courthouse, the vault was in perfect shape and all the materials in it were in very fine condition. And as a result of that, many of the old records, the plats of little communities that were in and around Castle Rock were still preserved, as well as commissioners' records.
We had primary source documentation.
The documentation revealed a contract issued to William Cantrell to build a courthouse on the corner of 4th and Wilcox Street. It spelled out exact dimensions, both interior and exterior, and outlined a timetable for completion.
It seemed logical that the county owned this and such a thing could happen at that time. But there was no proof. And the proof turned out to be something entirely different than what the stories were.
It is the myth of the moving courthouse. The courthouse still stands today with 2 smaller buildings on either side of it. And as you pass it, remember its history of serving the county.
Douglas County did the right thing in voting to locate her county seat at Castle Rock. It has all the elements and conditions at hand for an immediate, thriving, and permanent growth.
After the vote on March 31st, the commissioners directed that an area southwest of Castle Rock to be platted off into blocks, lots, streets, and alleys. The land was purchased from Jeremiah Gould on his homestead claim for a token of $1 and included his Uncle Jerry's claim cabin. Jeremiah Gould and John Craig filed an addition to the original town site on July 2, 1874. In the spring of 1875, an addition containing the rock was platted by Philip Wilcox and was known as the Wilcox Addition. The main street of the developing town of Castle Rock would become known as Wilcox Street, and Jerry Street was to be named after Jeremiah, Uncle Jerry, Gould. Natural and man-made barriers such as East Plum Creek and Sellers Gulch on the south, a plateau and railroad tracks on the west, and Schoolhouse Hill on the east defined the town's expansion. Businesses were developed west of the railroad tracks running through town, creating a commercial district which was centered on Wilcox Street, originally the old Territorial Trail. East of the railroad tracks, around Schoolhouse Hill, the neighborhood became solely residential.
In the fall of 1872, I planned to go east. I had been here 3 years and proved up on the homestead by counting my Army service, that being allowed. A 3-room cottage furnished in pioneer style, 3-legged stools, a homemade table, straw mattress, and other furnishings to correspond. All that remained to make my pioneer home complete was a girl in the calico dress, and she was 2,000 miles away.
The vernacular building style of the early homes was plain and functional wood frame and indigenous stone. Residents then applied architectural details from styles such as Italianate and Gothic Revival. The commercial and public buildings followed the same design patterns: vernacular stone, Italianate, and Gothic Revival. Douglas County's early industries were agriculture, ranching, and dairying. In 1872, a discovery by Silas Madge created an industry out of quarrying an indigenous stone called rhyolite. While searching for precious metals, Madge found the hard pinkish-gray rock on his ranch just south of Castle Rock. He sent several pieces to Denver to be assayed. The report stated that, although the rock specimen contains no precious metal, it would make an excellent building stone and might be quarried with profit. As a result of that report, the new industry that developed around Castle Rock had names such as the Madge, Santa Fe, Douglas, and O'Brien's. The rhyolite industry continues today at Schmidt Aggregates.
Okay. You learn the grain of the rock. You learn to look for individual small cracks, fine lines, how the rock is formed. Yeah, it had a flaw in it because it's built like a book. You have grains like pages, and you have a cover like the cover of a book. Yep, see, that's what happens when you have flaws. Some say it's 44 million years old, and some say it's 20 million years old. They're not sure if it came in a flow or if it was an airborne ash. Most think it's an airborne ash that was so hot when it landed, it adhesed itself back together, actually molded back together. And that causes for the color change. But the color change doesn't seem to come from a top layer. It comes from a side layer. Rhyolite's a good building material because it absorbs the water from the cement much faster, and it pulls the rocks tighter together. It cools the house more in the summer and keeps it warmer in the winter. On the older buildings, the cutting style is different. They would cut their blocks much thicker.
The Castle Rock quarry industry affected the local economy considerably, as up to 40 railroad cars of rhyolite a day were shipped as far away as Kansas City.
Buy lots now while they are cheap. The most important town between Denver and Colorado Springs, Castle Rock. Its location on the main line of 2 important railroads in the center of a rich agricultural district, the inexhaustible quarries of fine building stone in its immediate vicinity, and the fact that it is the county seat of one of the best dairy counties in the state bespeak for it a brilliant future.
Castle Rock's a real unique community in that it has so much historic context, existing buildings that date hundreds of years old, and it's real difficult to try to blend in current development or new developers coming in and building new structures right next to old, very old buildings. And it's a real challenge to try to blend the past with the present in a sympathetic manner.
We keep searching for property owners who are willing to landmark their properties. and take advantage of the funding and so on that's available for restoration of these historic properties.
Probably the best example would be Brad Brown and the Castle Cafe, or the Keystone Hotel, and that's the historic name, and that structure was also placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And when Brad came into town, he first came to the planning department and spoke with myself regarding some of the processes that he'd have to go through in order to renovate the interior and exterior to make it meet not only the local codes but the federal codes, because he wanted to landmark the building so that he could get special tax credits. So he came to me, and then I took the project to the Historic Preservation Board, and they reviewed and approved all of Brad's renovation designs.
We all participated to a greater or lesser extent in helping research that project.
I worked with the restoration group that Mr. Brown had hired, and we worked together gathering the history of that building. The public record didn't give enough clues for the Colorado Historical Society site survey, which they needed building dates and times and materials. The newspaper gave us the clues, from the issuing of the liquor license to Mr. Featherall, to the beginning of the digging of the basement, to Charles Herb cutting the load of stone that had been delivered. We put together quite a package of newspaper clippings and advertisements from the fair books, because Mr. Featheroff was very community conscious and advertised in a variety of places. The building received state and national landmark designation as the result of some of the research that was done in local history. And they also went on to decorate their walls with a few pictures from local history's collection to tie the building back to its past.
Brad is an excellent example of a person who appreciates the town's character, and particularly the existing old buildings like the Castle Cafe, and tries not to change them in any major sense except to update them to code where necessary.
It was very refreshing that he was willing to work with the town and the Historic Preservation Board in bringing all of those ideas to reality.
It's a pleasure to see that building come alive again, the lights glowing in the windows at night, and to see the activity on the inside. The restoration is a credit to the craftsmen that worked on it, and to Mr. Brown, the owner, who put in so much dedication to give this stone building life again. It's a jewel.
Our main concerns, of course, are to try to create new development that's compatible with the existing historic development in town. And that sometimes can be very difficult because everybody has their own ideas and designs that they've used in other communities. And they always don't work here because we're trying to create some cohesiveness and blend in some of the new structures with the historic structures in town. So that's a very difficult task.
We like to stress the advantage side, because people, regardless of what we suggest to them, will believe that there's some downside to landmarking your property or having it recognized as a historic landmark in town. There is no downside, but there are some wonderful advantages in terms of grant capabilities for restoration purposes, both residential and business and commercial.
Benefits would include some actual renovation tax credits through the state, which could be upwards of 20% of the cost of your renovation. Additionally, there are some grants that the town is continuously trying to get from the State Historical Fund, and those grants would be a 50% match in upwards of $10,000. So that's a great benefit that we try to encourage people to landmark their property so that they can reap the benefits of some of these financial gains.
One of the things we hope for is that up front they will get some information about the town's history that's made available through the town, and look at our downtown guidelines if they're working with the downtown area, or that they will develop along the lines that are suggested there. To this date, there are 80 buildings on the historic inventory, 80 odd, and we have adopted also a landmarking program that is a much smaller number of buildings. It's, I believe, at about 15 at this point. The Town Historic Board has put together a self-guided tour of downtown historic buildings and is currently in the process of publishing a similar historic tour of residential areas in Old Town Castle Rock.
From its beginnings, the town leaders emphasized creating a pleasant community. Early efforts, such as an 1884 tree planting ordinance, encouraged citizens to plant cottonwood trees. The shade trees were considered essential to Castle Rock's beautification. Rose bushes and lilacs were to become a common favorite as well. The commitment to the town's appearance grew as citizens began promoting Castle Rock as a destination for visitors arriving on excursions from Denver and Colorado Springs. Early community events brought the townspeople together, such as the first horse fair in 1890, which led to the first county fair in 1892. From the 1880s to the 1920s, construction in Castle Rock followed railroad, agriculture, and stone quarry success. Several early business structures survive today, given new life by citizens committed to our historic cultural heritage. First National Bank, built in 1903. St. Francis of Assisi Church, built in 1889. And of course, the Keystone Hotel, built in 1901. Upton Treat Smith, by his own words earlier in his life, might have been accused of putting on style when he built his new home in 1902 of rhyolite stone in the heart of town.
As we're moving into this next century, I think people are beginning to become more interested in the heritage. Granted, it's not their heritage because we are a nation of transplanted people, but they are interested in what took place around here, how did things come to be, and they're beginning to take more interest in documenting their surroundings. Such things as the first museum in Castle Rock happened here within the last 10 years. Historical societies, people becoming interested in what happened on the land where my house now stands. What if I find something? Is it significant? How could I relate to it?
Touching the past gives today's life a fuller meaning. When I understand what happened in the past times, I have a greater appreciation for life today. I see that in my patrons that come searching. Perhaps it's a new piece of property that's never been built on, and there's an old foundation that they're wondering, what was here before? We can offer a few clues, and it gives them meaning as they build a new life on that land, realizing that there was a family there before them, a homesteader, or maybe someone at the turn of the century. We all want to know something of our history so that we feel attached.
I often refer back to a library that I patronized as a graduate student at the University of Colorado. And a saying it said above that he who knows only of his own generation remains always a child. And I think that's so true, that if you really want to know how to maybe deal with the future, look at the past and see what have our forefathers done. Some of them were quite eloquent in their thinking and their speaking and the way they attended to such issues.
Working with local history is working a puzzle. Many of the pieces are missing. This collection is 6 years old, and we are just beginning to collect the pieces of the puzzle of our unique heritage. It's a detective work, it's fun, it's sleuthing, it's digging into unlikely places, looking for the answers. Local history has a number of aspects of bringing the primary source material to the people and answering their questions or their quest. I noticed a young man at our reader printer night after night, reel after reel of the newspaper. And one night I introduced myself to him and joked about giving frequent flyer miles on the reader printer. And in conversation he said, "Do you happen to know where the Cottage Hotel is?" And I said, "Yes, I do." "Well, I can't find it anywhere." And I said, "I can find it for you." And I brought out the Sanborn maps, which we have from 1890 to 1930. And I said, "There's the Cottage Hotel." And he said, "That's where my great-grandfather moved his office." His great-grandfather was Dr. William Maxwell, a physician in Castle Rock in the 1890s. And a friendship has grown over the work that that young man has done, digging into his family history and touching his roots in Castle Rock. Pieces of our past are still here, and people are connecting to them. Local history cares for the collective memory and the historical record of Douglas County, and we depend upon the community to share their pieces of history with us to bring this puzzle back together.
We brought with us many of the dreams that we had from Connecticut to Ohio to South Carolina. We tried to build even similar structures initially. I think the character of a community and the sense of its roots is so important. School kids that visit the museum are a good example. They have no idea that there was ever an old courthouse which burned down before their time, or that people who moved here donated the property that the town was actually formed on in 1874. Those people brought with them tales from other parts of the world and tended to name the communities with names that were familiar to them. So their history, their lives, their tales are our history now, those of us who choose to live here. It's hard to describe that when you get right down to it in terms that are not pretty fanciful, but that's the way it is.
It was December 8, 1872, that I returned with my life partner and installed her as queen of our humble pioneer home. We recall with pleasure those early times, how we enjoyed planning, working, and improving our homes. We were loyal to our country's flag and on the most friendly terms with the silver dollar on which was stamped, "In God We Trust."
The year 1888, in a sense, defined the end of the days of the homesteading pioneers and founders of our county. Plans were being made to replace the simple courthouse which was constructed back in 1874 when the county seat was moved from Frankstown to Castle Rock. Today, we inherit and honor the dreams and efforts of the pioneers as we continue to build into a new century, remembering our historic past.